You're listening to the Shared Security Podcast with Tom Eston and Scott Wright, exploring the trust you put in people, apps, and technology.
Hello and welcome to the Shared Security Podcast. I'm Scott Wright, the Streetwise Security Coach here in Ottawa, Canada, and I'm on the YouTube with our fearless co-host Tom Tiberius Eston in Cleveland.
Tiberius, wow, that's a new one.
And this is
but I'll take it, Scott.
This is a special episode of the Shared Security Podcast where we literally have zero to talk about today. Hey, Tom.
Hi, hey, Scott. We actually have zero trust to talk about today, which we'll get into here in a minute. So today we're joined by Harry Sverdlove, who is the founder and chief technology officer of Edgewise. Harry has a long career in cybersecurity as the former CTO of Carbon Black and was also a principal research scientist for McAfee. Welcome to the show, Harry.
Thanks, Tom. Really glad to be here.
So a question I like to ask all of our guests is, how did your career in cybersecurity start?
Well, definitely I'm going to start dating myself here because I come from the generation where nobody actually studied cybersecurity at universities or at schools. You were sort of thrown into it. In my case, I've been in information technology for the better part of 30 years, but going back almost 20 years now, where I was working at CompuWare, we were doing memory leak detection, performance detection, and it was more targeted for developers, but had obviously a cybersecurity tinge to it, if you will, because the kinds of flaws we found could and would be used in attacks. I left there and became chief scientist of a company called SiteAdvisor, which did website security ratings. Very shortly thereafter was acquired by McAfee, and thus sort of my journey into the heart of darkness, if you will. A couple of years at McAfee and watching that sausage making process occur. And then I joined, at the time it was Bit9, as their chief technology officer, eventually became Carbon Black, and was there for 8 years. And then 3 years ago, I left, took a couple months break. But the thing about cybersecurity for anybody in the business, it's like crack cocaine. You get addicted a couple months in and you start waking up in the middle of the night with shakes. And so I joined along with my partner, Peter Smith, and we founded Edgewise.
Wow, that's awesome. So was your time at McAfee, was that pre or post John McAfee? I assume it was post John McAfee.
It was post John McAfee, but okay. Everybody always asks me about that. And did I ever party with him in some strange island off of Spain or something? And the answer is no.
Good answer. Probably the answer you want to give, right?
Yeah, it's the answer that I'm going on the record with. So
Fair enough. So when you started Edgewise, what was the problem that you saw and what was the goal of the company from the early onset?
Definitely. Well, so one of the problems, and I've lived through enough breaches and been both as a vendor for customers, but also personally been in breach situations and in war rooms where I've seen the challenge of what happens both before, during, and after a breach. And we're dealing with, and the problem we were trying to solve is lateral movement and network segmentation. And we've been dealing with firewall technology, the same technology for 30 years now, that's all based off of addresses. Basically, they're based off packet inspection. So source, destination, port protocol, and that just doesn't scale. It doesn't scale. It doesn't work in today's elastic environments. It doesn't work to actually stop attackers. So time and time again, we saw, and I've been a part of watching attackers piggyback off of policies. And so what ends up happening is we end up in a world where we're promoting more and more network segmentation. And then you end up with complex thousands and thousands of rules, all to try to manage something that what you're really trying to do is secure what are my applications communicating. And I want my trusted users and applications to communicate. And I don't have an effective tool to do that. So that's a long story short to say that what we're trying to solve is we're trying to stop data lateral movement and data exfiltration. And we're trying to do that with the tools that are more appropriate for modern architectures.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know as a former pen tester myself, lateral movement was my best friend, right? Get credentials, jump from one system to another, and then eventually, get to the crown jewels of a company.
Right. Yeah. And there are different reports on this. I think the latest report is it takes on average less than 2 hours for an attacker once they make a foothold to move to another machine, which is not surprising because if you think about it, networks are built to facilitate communication. That's their purpose. Their goal is to make sure everybody can communicate, and it's to enable that. And we're using that same platform, that same dimension to try and restrict communication. And obviously fighting against ourselves. So most networks are at least 90% overexposed. So it's very easy for an attacker, once you're on one system, to nmap, to probe around, find 200 other systems that are listening on something and just piggyback on a policy, steal a credential, and hop onto the next machine.
So we hear the term zero trust nowadays. It's a frequent buzzword in the industry now. What exactly is zero trust as it relates to Edgewise?
Sure. So zero trust actually started unfortunately, when things gain popularity, they gain buzzword status. So we might as well call it artificial intelligence zero trust cloud. But it was actually a term coined by Forrester almost 10 years ago to the date. And in its essence, zero trust, if you think about most networks, they operate under a trust but verify mantra. You get into the network if you're logged in, or if you're at a local address, now you are trusted, and then they just watch your activity. Zero trust turns that upside down and says never trust and always verify. But for us at Edgewise, what does it really mean is it basically means stop trusting static locations and addresses, but instead make your trust decisions based off of the identity of things. So whether it's the user, it's the workload, based off of identity, environment, and transaction. So it's not just, are you trusted? But are you trusted? Are you in a trusted situation? And are you making a trusted request? So the idea behind zero trust is assume your network is already breached. Just assume it. Assume that it doesn't matter if you're in a coffee shop or if you're in your local cubicle. You are essentially the same level of trust no matter where you are. And now base your trust decisions off of as adaptively what transaction you're doing and who you are at the time you're doing it. That is, if you will, that is the essence of zero trust networking.
Can you give us maybe an example of maybe like a malicious attacker that might be coming into a network and we're assuming it's already compromised, right? There's vulnerabilities all over the place. How would Edgewise fit into a situation or a scenario like that?
Sure. So if you take a look and you can almost classify more than 90% of breaches as having some level of lateral movement involved in it. And so how does that typically work? So you go back as an example. 2 years ago, University of Berkeley was breached. 80,000 student and faculty records were stolen. How did it happen? It happened because there's a vulnerability on one of their public-facing web servers, which, by the way, with 19 vulnerabilities a day, you know more than anybody, vulnerabilities are happening all the time. So it's inevitable. And once the attacker was on that web server, they simply accessed the database. Now, there was a next-gen firewall between the web server and the database. So what did it do? It said, this address can talk to that address, but only if they're talking SQL. It doesn't actually know who's talking. So the attacker drops a malicious Python script. It's not the application, the web application. And from there, they're able to talk to the database through the firewall all day long. Another example, the Equifax breach. Again, a vulnerability in Apache struts. Easy that an attacker gets a foothold, and once they're there, they either use existing programs living off the land or they drop their own malware. It doesn't matter. Either way, once they're on that system, they move laterally. And they can do that because the only thing stopping them is a firewall. And that firewall is basically saying, I'm going to stop you based on, are you a known address that, are you at an address I allow, but they're already inside your organization. Your address is allowed. So Edgewise is an example. Our policies are not based off of address. So an Edgewise policy might be something as simple as my sales application can talk to my database. On that system, it doesn't matter what the network address is, that application can talk. But if another application or an attacker lands on the system, creates a Python script, drops anything, or does something else, they will not have access. They will go ahead and try to access the database, but they're not the cryptographic identity of the application you authorized. So that's an example of, another way to kind of think about this. The metaphor we like to use is imagine from a network perspective, you're at the bottom of a swimming pool. That's the network. The network is the water. And you're looking up and you're seeing people walk by. But you can't really see them, right? They're all fuzzy and kind of looks like Tom walking by. It has a plaid shirt on, and I have no idea. They're they're trying to divine what's happening. what we're doing is we move the control plane out of the network back up to where the workloads are. And we're actually making our security decisions above the water. We see who you are, what your identity is, and we see where you're trying to go, and we authorize both sides of the equation.
How would you say it's different than, say, traditional whitelisting, blacklisting, and maybe the endpoint protection solutions, which have pretty much been kind of the primary means of a lot of organizations trying to defend their networks?
Definitely. And of course, I have quite a bit of experience with endpoint security and with Carbon Black. One of the biggest challenges with the whitelisting, of course, I am a proponent of whitelisting and of EDR and endpoint security. I think it's an important layer, but one of the biggest challenges when we were building out Bit9 and whitelisting was the idea that this determination of is software good or is it bad? It doesn't always work, especially when you're dealing with dual purpose software. So take, for example, a shell or Python or Java. Well, is Python trusted? Is it good or is it bad? Well, that decision depends on who's using it and what they're doing with it. And when you're dealing with pure whitelisting and pure blacklisting, most of those technologies, they're designed to either detect this thing that's running, is it good or is it bad? If it's bad on a blacklisting case, I ban it. If it's good, I allow it. But that determination is just based off of, if you will, the identity. What we do is we're not an EDR solution. We're not sitting there trying to do that. We're dealing with what is the communication that they're trying to do. So Python talking to your database, that might be bad because that's unexpected. But being Python talking to some other system that you're using for your business, that might be totally authorized. And so we make our decisions based off of not just the entity communicating, but what it's communicating and who's on the other end. So we actually verify identities on both sides. Essentially, if you could take all these EDR or even whitelisting solutions, stitch them together, make them much lighter weight, and actually only make the authorization decisions based on their communication, that's Edgewise.
Really, Edgewise seems to me like a good part of any good security program from a defense in depth perspective, right? I mean, you're still going to have endpoint solutions. You're still going to have, other types of security controls, but sounds like Edgewise is a network type solution that is just going to help defend a company's network.
Yeah. And obviously, of course, I'm biased. I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't have founded Edgewise if I didn't think so. But absolutely, one of the most important things we can do is protect our communications. And Edgewise is obviously what I believe in an important part of that defense that you need. And the nice thing about this is it allows you to create policies because they're based off of identity that are much more flexible for today's modern world. So what happens today, it's not only critical foundational. And if you look at Gartner or Forrester or many of those, they say network segmentation and network security is a foundational technology. Edgewise is a player in that space, but it also is it's appropriate for the form factors of today. So think about cloud environments where you have elastic computing, you have systems and addresses coming and going all the time. Typically a traditional firewall, certainly the kind that you have to plug wires in, that doesn't work because there's no wires in the cloud. So you have virtual firewalls. And for that, since they can't handle all the changing addresses, you end up creating overly generous rules, saying anything in that VPC can talk to that VPC. Edgewise allows you to create policies that whether you're in a staging environment, a production environment, they travel with the workload. And yeah, it's definitely a critical layer on top of course, then you'd have EDR, identity access management. There's no one solution. I'd love to say, by the way, that, buy Edgewise, go home, hug your kids, no more security problem. Believe me, I would say it if I could. It's not the only part of your security stack, but it is a critical part.
So what's the typical deployment look like? Like how is Edgewise installed, and is it something that's really easy to do in most organizations, or can it be pretty complex?
No, it's definitely very easy. What the way Edgewise works is we have a dynamically loadable kernel module that you install. It doesn't require reboots. It doesn't require anything. We provide both Puppet and Chef recipes, or you can push it through your software distribution, or push it into your base images. For example, if you're dealing with cloud images, your AMIs, you simply push out the agent, and in the first 24 hours. It watches all of the traffic. It fingerprints all of the applications that are communicating, and immediately you start to see how things are communicating. But we're not talking just net flows. Everybody's got net flow capture, and it's a terabyte of of data that just essentially gets stuffed in a hard drive somewhere until emergency. These are application flows. So we visualize, and you log into our console, within minutes of deploying the agent, and you start seeing how applications are communicating. Within 24 hours, we start making recommendations for you. So behind the Edgewise system is a machine learning system that's analyzing how your workloads are communicating. Within 48 hours, we've usually achieved on most organizations 99.99% coverage, where we'll say, look, this is your organization. These are how things are communicating across containers, hosts, workloads, and here's our recommended policies. If you want to just monitor and say, okay, great, I don't want to stop anything. I just want to monitor for deviations from that. You can do that, and then there's no change to your policies. Or you can click on our recommendations or make your own, of course, and say, I want to enforce that. What you've just recommended as workflows, enforce it, and any deviation from that will either get alerted or prevented depending on your security posture. And that, as I say, that process of install usually takes 15 minutes to install it out to your agents, maybe 30. The process of getting recommendations takes 24 hours, 48 hours for complete recommendations, and running policies, depending on how you're doing that, that can happen almost immediately.
So I think of the days when I was installing intrusion prevention systems, and you have them set up in a learning mode for a while, and then you flip the switch and turn it on, and then the entire network comes down to a screeching halt. I assume that Edgewise has protections, and when you're turning everything on after the learning mode, it's not as invasive, right, as a traditional IPS.
For sure. And in fact, actually, you'll notice one of the things I didn't say it was a learning mode. I said
okay.
But this is important because we actually don't have a learning mode, apply mode. We're always learning. So the way the engine works is it's actually for all the data it sees, it builds a model of your communication off the first 90% and validates it off the next 10%. And it does this continuously so that there is no switch to say, I want to go into apply mode. It's up to you. You decide, do I want to accept a recommendation or not? And we're always learning. So we're always seeing when the model changes, if it changes too rapidly, or if it doesn't match what we then see. One of the things we expose is what's our confidence in the model. So we expose not just our recommendations, but here's our confidence that this is actually what's happening. Obviously, in the early, when you first deploy, our confidence is low. It builds up. If we see change, we adjust the model and/or we alert you. So it's not that you don't have to worry about, am I on alert mode, am I in apply mode, or am I going to break my network? The other thing that's really important, and this is really ultimately why we built the Edgewise technology, is in a firewall technology. When you apply those rules, inevitably things are going to break if you actually do it right, because addresses change too much. Our rules are not associated to your network topology. They're associated to your applications and their identity. So as an example, there was one customer, they did an analysis of their unique net flow, and within a 24-hour period, there was 14,000 unique address-to-address connections that we observed. We were able to describe that in less than 7 dozen application rules. So they turn out to be much less, a much lower volume and much more flexible, because we're not interested in the things that are volatile and changing. We're interested in what's actually happening.
So kind of a real world breach example, stolen credentials, right? A real popular way of compromising applications and systems, phishing attacks, social engineering. We talk a lot about that on our podcast. How can Edgewise prevent data breach from using stolen credentials?
Yeah, there's no question. So if you think about, and let's talk about zero trust in general, which is this idea of always validating identity. There's zero trust at the perimeter, which is how do you validate users from getting into your organization? And for those, I definitely recommend you have things like two-factor authentication and things like that. Our focus today with the Edgewise technology is on data centers and on cloud, where these are non-interactive processes communicating. And if you think about how a workload, or if you think about multi-factor authentication, what is multi-factor authentication? It's something you know and something you are. So you know a password, and in the case of two-factor, maybe it's because you have your cell phone or you have some other factor. Well, how do you do that when these are back-end applications communicating? So all applications already have the something you know, that's the password. So the user compromises that and they run a piece of software on a system. They have the something you know, but what about the something they are? And another way to view what is the way Edgewise works is it's multi-factor authentication for workloads. interactive or non-interactive, we fingerprint those identities. So you might have the right credentials, like in the case of that Berkeley breach I talked about. You've got the right credentials, so you have the what you have part, but you aren't the correct authorized application. So you aren't who you say you are, or you aren't what the policy says you are, and so you won't be able to get in. And the way that Edgewise does, as I say, is what we do is we take cryptographic fingerprints of the different applications, the hash, the loaded modules, all of these, the digital certificate if it's signed, all of these attributes that are hard, if not impossible, to spoof. Certainly in the aggregate, they're impossible to spoof. And that's how we define what you as a workload or as an application are. You could have the credentials all day long, it won't matter.
That's great.
A quick question for you, Harry, just a thought that I had in terms of, you mentioned you're sort of tracking the sensitive or important flows, and you're not worried about the ones that are not so important. How is there a way that you determine or tag different flows as being important or not important?
From a modeling perspective, and of course, there's a whole data science behind that, and we have people with more PhDs than I've been in cybersecurity so that think about these things. But a lot of that has to do with one of the things we do is we do location analysis. So we see, and by location, I don't mean network address. I mean, where is it in the communication path? So imagine, for example, like a star pattern. If you see a lot of things communicating with something, typically like a database or something, there is a set of importance to that because it's centrally accessed. An Active Directory server would be an example, but we don't do this based off of heuristics or hard coding. We do this based off of watching traffic. Frequency and diversity of communication allows you to assess how likely is this communication to happen, how important is that communication. But the model will account for less frequent traffic as well, if in fact it's happening on enough basis for which that we can define this fits the mathematical models of once, a good example might be a backup process, or some utility that you run either once every 24 hours or once every month. And those don't happen very frequently, and they don't communicate with things that are necessarily central hubs, and yet those get accounted for because of their periodicity. Periodicity, yeah.
Yeah, I think I get what you mean. Yeah, I was trying to think of a situation where something might be trying to use a well-known software application, but doing it in a different way, maliciously, perhaps. So, for example, maybe an Office document, a Word document with a macro that has been weaponized and is trying to reach someplace that you wouldn't normally do. You would not be looking necessarily at the Word document or the Word executable. You'd be looking at the traffic that's coming.
And that's a perfect example of the challenge with whitelisting purely, which is, Word or Office is trusted. So that's great. But all of a sudden, Office is communicating with service host on my Active Directory server in some strange way. That's kind of weird. That kind of profiling that we are able to do, because we're not saying Office is good or bad. We're saying Office talking to service host, that's not good. That's
right.
So how can our listeners contact you or Edgewise to set up a demo and find out more about your product?
Oh, definitely. So www.edgewise.net. If you go to our website, right in the top right corner, there's a big button that says request a demo. And you can certainly go there. I'm happy to talk about security and about Edgewise anytime. I'm Harry at edgewise.net. So pretty easy to reach. And yeah, just definitely go check out. Check out a demo, request a demo, or feel free to ping me with any questions you want as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Harry, for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
No problem. Tom, Scott, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.